Unraveling the Darkness. The Haunting Tale of Miya Marcano. Hook. What if the thing you fear most is yourself? Miya Marcano's nightmare takes her to the edge of reality, where the shadows blur and every step brings her closer to a chilling discovery. Will she escape the endless void, or is she trapped forever? Stay tuned to uncover the spine-tingling truth. The night air was thick, heavy, oppressive. Miya stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence was unnerving. She glanced at her phone. No new messages. She sighed. Another long shift had ended. Another night alone. But something felt different. A chill crept along her skin. She tightened her jacket, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to stave off the sudden unease. Her feet echoed against the cold tile. Every step seemed too loud. Her eyes darted to the corners, half expecting movement. But there was nothing. Yet the air felt dense, alive, like it was pressing in on her. She kept walking, past the rows of rooms. The hotel was quiet, too quiet. As she passed the staff office, she slowed. A faint light flickered inside. It was odd. No one was supposed to be there. Mia's heart raced. She took a hesitant step forward. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, to keep walking, but her curiosity held her in place. Her fingers brushed the door handle. Cold. Too cold. A sharp intake of breath. Her fingers trembled. She pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the room was empty, but the flickering light, the bulb buzzed like an old, dying thing. Something was off. A faint smell. Something metallic. Mia's pulse quickened. She stepped further into the room, scanning the space. Empty desks. Empty chairs. Except for one thing. A bag. Her bag. Her heart skipped. It was sitting in the corner. It wasn't there before. She didn't leave it. She never left it. The weight of the bag, the way it sat there, waiting. Miya felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Her breath caught in her throat. She crossed the room in 2 long strides. The bag felt heavy as she reached for it. Too heavy. She opened it. Inside, something shifted. A piece of paper. Folded. Torn. She unfolded it slowly. A name. Her name. Written in black ink. Mia's hands shook as she read the rest. A message. No, not a message. A warning. And then she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood upright. Her body froze. She didn't dare turn around. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mia's breath hitched, trapped in her chest. She clenched her fists around the paper. Her eyes darted to the door. It was too far. Her heart pounded like a drum. Another step. It was right behind her now. The air thickened. The silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of her own breathing. She counted the seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3. Should she scream? Run? Her pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't move. Not yet. The footsteps stopped. Mia's stomach twisted. She could feel their presence. Right there. Breathing. Watching. Her palms slick with sweat. She turned the paper over, hoping it might somehow shield her. But the message stared back at her. No escape. A voice. Low. Barely a whisper. Did you think you could leave? It wasn't a question. It was a threat. Her body tensed. A cold breath brushed against her neck. Miya spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty again. Her legs were trembling, but she couldn't move. Not until she saw it. A shadow. It lurked in the farthest corner of the room. A shape. Tall. Looming. The outline of a figure. But there was no face. Only darkness. It was watching her. Mia's throat went dry. What was that? Her eyes refused to leave the shadow. It didn't move. It didn't need to. But she could feel it pressing in, filling the room with a heavy, suffocating weight. The darkness seemed to stretch, reaching toward her. She stumbled back. Her legs gave way. She collapsed to the floor. Her heart pounded harder now. The shadow didn't advance. It waited. Miya gasped for air, but it was hard to breathe. The temperature in the room dropped. Her breath turned visible, a cloud in the freezing air. Her hands shook uncontrollably, but she couldn't look away. The shadow began to shift. It wasn't just standing anymore. It was coming closer. The walls seemed to close in on her. The paper in her hand crumpled. She couldn't think, couldn't speak. Only one thought clawed at her mind. She had to get out. But the shadow reached out first, fingers long and skeletal. Mia's skin crawled. Before she could even scream, the figure's hand wrapped around her wrist. The pressure, the cold, it was unbearable. And then everything went black. That Mia's world dissolved into darkness. A suffocating, oppressive void. Her breath was shallow, labored. She couldn't move. Her body felt like it was being crushed. Her chest tightened with panic. Someone was holding her. She could feel it, the weight of their presence. But there was no escape, no way to fight. The air around her smelled of decay, rotting, stale. And then a voice. It was distant but clear. "You're not leaving." The words slid into her mind like poison. Her eyes snapped open. The darkness was still there, thick and heavy. But now she could hear something. Soft whispers, like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. They were all around her. Miya tried to move, but her limbs felt numb. Her head spun. She felt like she was underwater. Fingers, cold and clammy, brushed her cheek. She jerked, but she couldn't escape them. The whispers grew louder, closer, tighter. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperate for silence. But the voices didn't stop. They were chanting now in a language she couldn't understand. The words twisted, unnerved her, like nails scraping against glass. Her body was trembling, shaking with fear. And then, a sudden, blinding light. It was so bright that her vision blurred. Miya gasped, her eyes watering. The light expanded, enveloping her. For a moment, there was nothing but white. The voices faded. The cold lifted. She could breathe again. Her surroundings began to form. Dimly lit corridors, unfamiliar. And a sound, heavy footsteps. They were coming closer. Her heart raced again. She looked around, disoriented, but everything felt wrong. There were no windows. The walls seemed to close in. She was trapped, but not alone. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and imposing. A man dressed in black. His eyes glowed an unnatural red. His smile was wide, cruel. He took a step toward her, slow, methodical. "Did you really think you could run?" he asked, his voice like velvet. Miya recoiled, but she had no place to go, no way to hide. His gaze pierced her, reading her thoughts. "You're not the first," he continued, his smile never fading. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The walls groaned, as if the building itself was alive. Miya swallowed hard. The walls were moving, closing in. The footsteps were louder now, but there was nowhere to run. Only one way forward. The figure raised a hand. A cold, suffocating presence swept over her. Miya tried to scream, but no sound came out. The light dimmed again, and then it was just her, alone. In the suffocating dark, her breath caught in her throat. The darkness pressed in, tighter and tighter. Her limbs were frozen, like she was trapped in some invisible grip. She tried to move, but her body betrayed her. She felt weightless, suspended in an endless void. Nothing made sense. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Only silence, then a shift, a sharp, sudden pull on her chest. It felt like something was dragging her down. Her vision blurred again, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to dissolve. Everything was twisting. The shadows around her began to stretch, forming strange, contorted shapes. A figure emerged, but this one was different. It wasn't human. The creature's body seemed to writhe, a mass of tendrils and smoke. Its face, or what could have been its face, was a mask of darkness, shifting in shape, never the same for more than a moment. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were holes, empty and infinite. The air grew colder. Mia's breath turned to mist in front of her. She backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. But the creature followed. It glided, not walking, but moving like liquid through the air. The temperature dropped further. Her skin prickled with cold, an unnatural chill sinking deep into her bones. The creature reached out, its form undulating like it was made of smoke. It seemed to hover, as though the air itself bent around it. "Why?" Miya gasped, her voice cracking. The creature didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The darkness thickened, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Then, with a sudden, sickening crack, the creature opened its mouth. A gaping maw filled with rows of jagged teeth, too many to count. The sound was deafening, like the tearing of fabric, as it lunged toward her. Mia's body went numb with fear. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness closed in. She could feel the weight of it now, pressing against her chest. Her heart pounded, faster and faster. And then, the cold touch of the creature's hand was on her wrist. Its fingers twisted like vines, curling around her arm. The grip tightened. Miya gasped, but there was no air. Her vision spun. The ground was vanishing. She couldn't escape. The creature's grip was unrelenting. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And just when she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, everything stopped. The cold, the fear, the creature. It all vanished in a blink. Miya found herself standing, alone, in the hallway. The same hallway from before. But now, something was different. The air was thick again. The shadows still lingered at the edges of her vision. But now they were moving. Closer. Miya turned, heart racing. The hallway stretched on forever. The familiar door at the end of the corridor was now distant, unreachable. Her mind reeled. What was happening? She reached for her phone. No signal. No messages. Nothing. The silence returned, oppressive and thick. She heard a soft sound, whispering, faint, like a distant cry. Her feet moved of their own accord. She couldn't stop. She walked faster, her pulse rising. The whispering grew louder. She could feel it behind her. Breathe, breathe. Her fingers gripped her phone so tightly. Her knuckles whitened. She glanced behind. Nothing. Just shadows. But there was movement. In the corners of her eyes. A flicker. A presence. Mia's breath caught again. She had to keep moving. She had to escape. But the hallway stretched further. Endlessly. And the whispering, it was louder now. Closer. Too close. Then, the lights flickered. And Miya saw it. A face. In the reflection of the glass, a pale, hollow-eyed face. Her own, but not. It was twisted, distorted, and its mouth was moving, saying something. She couldn't hear it, but she could feel it. The presence was back, closer than before. The air around her thickened again, tighter, and as she turned, the face in the glass smiled. Miya stopped breathing. The footsteps were back, behind her, closer. Too close, the footsteps were right there. She could feel them, closing in. Mia's heart hammered in her chest. She turned, faster than she'd ever moved before. But there was nothing but the empty hallway, stretching endlessly before her. Her breath came in sharp gasps, ragged and quick. Her legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, shifting, twisting. It was as if the very building was alive, watching her. The whispering was back. It was louder now, closer. The words were garbled, distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. But she could make out one word, her name, Miya. Her body froze. She couldn't move. It was impossible. The whispers surrounded her now, echoing in every corner of the room. The air was thick with the scent of decay again, sour, metallic. A low growl rumbled in the distance. Her pulse spiked, and then the lights flickered once more. Faster this time. Mia's heart raced. She spun, but there was nothing there. Only the same cold, empty hallway. But this time, the silence felt different, heavier. Something was coming. She could feel it. Her chest tightened, suffocating. Her vision blurred at the edges, the hallway distorting. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing. The ceiling above her was too low, too close. The floor beneath her feet trembled. Something moved under the surface. A deep, rumbling tremor. And then a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Tall, dark, unfathomable. It wasn't human. Its shape was indistinct, like it was shifting with every blink. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed. Faint red pinpricks in the darkness. The air grew colder still. Mia's breath turned to mist. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a step forward, and another, each movement slow, deliberate. Miya felt her legs give way beneath her. But she couldn't fall. She couldn't let herself fall. She had to run, had to get away. But her feet were frozen to the floor. The figure was closer now. Its presence filled the room, suffocating her. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before. They were all around her now. Miya clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The words dug into her brain. Miya, it's time. The figure loomed over her now. It reached out with a hand, impossibly long, its fingers curling like claws. Mia's chest constricted. Her vision narrowed. Her breath caught in her throat. The thing was right there, right in front of her. Its fingers brushed against her cheek. Cold, like ice. She gasped, her skin burning under the touch. The creature's voice was low, raspy, like something ancient. Your time is up. Miya didn't know what happened next. One moment, she was standing there, trapped in its grip. And the next, everything was gone. The figure, the hallway, the whispers, the cold. The silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. She was weightless, suspended in nothing. But the darkness was back. It was endless, an endless void. And Miya felt herself falling deeper, into the unknown. Her heart slammed in her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. The darkness swallowed her whole. And then, nothing. Mia's eyes snapped open. She was back in the hallway, but it was different this time. The walls were cracked, the ceiling sagging, like the building itself was decaying. The flickering lights overhead buzzed, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts. She wasn't sure how she got here, but it felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, something foul. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, and then she heard it, a faint sound at first, a whisper. No, more like a hum. It was coming from ahead, deep within the hallway. Miya took a step forward, her body still trembling, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to turn back to run, but some force compelled her to keep moving. The humming grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound. It was low, subtle, like a vibration under her skin. And then, a door she didn't remember seeing before. It stood ajar, a faint light spilling from within, just enough to make out the edges of the room. Mia's feet moved toward it, slowly, reluctantly. Her body was trembling. She wanted to stop, to turn away, but her legs wouldn't listen. As she stepped closer, the humming intensified. It was almost deafening now, and the light from the room, bright, sterile, seemed to pull her in. Her pulse quickened. What was in there? What was waiting for her? She hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the door. Her fingers ached to touch it, to push it open, but she couldn't. Something was stopping her. The humming, it wasn't coming from the room anymore. It was inside her. Her head pounded, her vision blurred. Miya placed a hand on the doorframe, bracing herself. She felt the coldness of it seep into her skin. And then the light flickered. The door swung open by itself. Her heart stopped. The room beyond was nothing like she expected. It was small, cramped, but it felt familiar. Too familiar. The walls were lined with old photographs, old faces staring out at her. The same faces she saw when she looked in the mirror. Her eyes widened. Each photo was a distorted version of herself. Twisted, faded. Miya took a step inside, but her legs felt weak. The air grew heavier. The photos seemed to shift as she moved, their expressions changing, becoming more distorted, more twisted. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Something in the corner of the room. She turned, but nothing. Her pulse raced, but the feeling lingered. She stepped further in. A large mirror stood at the far end of the room, its surface cracked, jagged, but still reflecting her image. Her reflection, but it was wrong. Her face was distorted, the eyes wide, unblinking. Something moved behind her reflection. A shadow, tall, lurking. It didn't belong. Her heart pounded harder. Miya spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark room. Her reflection, though, still stared at her. And then it smiled, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched impossibly across its face. Miya gasped, stepping back. The reflection's eyes locked onto hers. It spoke, but no words came from its mouth. Instead, the room seemed to shake. The mirror cracked. The reflection twisted, its face distorting. The smile widened. The air grew thick with pressure. And then, a voice. It wasn't her voice. It was a low, guttural growl. "You can never leave." Mia's chest tightened. The room spun around her. The walls were closing in. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry. Nothing came out, and as the shadows crawled closer, her reflection reached out, its fingers cold and elongated, stretching toward her. The world went black again, and Miya felt herself falling into nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole. It was suffocating, unyielding. Mia's body felt weightless, but her mind was trapped in a haze of panic. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her chest tightened with every breath she tried to take, but the air was gone. Just endless blackness. She felt as though she were falling through an endless void, spinning in circles, her limbs caught in an unseen current. Her eyes were wide open, but she couldn't see. There was nothing, not even the distant hum or whisper of the thing that had followed her. Just silence, heavy, unbearable, and then, without warning, a sound. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, a low, grinding noise. A door scraping open. Mia's body jolted, her heart thumping violently in her chest. She wasn't alone. She could feel it now. The presence. It was close. Too close. Her limbs finally regained feeling, and she pushed herself to her feet, even though she wasn't sure what was real anymore. The ground beneath her was cold, slick, almost wet. She reached out, her hand brushing against something. A wall. A rough, uneven surface. But the moment she touched it, she felt it shift. A twitch. A breath. Miya recoiled, but it wasn't enough. Her fingers brushed against something soft, warm. A body. A human body. Her heart stopped in her chest. She couldn't move. Couldn't scream. The figure was cold, lifeless, at least it seemed to be. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against a face. A familiar face. Mia's own, but not. Her reflection again. The face in the darkness. The same eyes. The same hollow, empty expression. It was her, but twisted. The smile stretched wider. Miya stumbled back, horrified. Her breath hitched in her throat. The face didn't blink. It didn't move. It just stared. Her reflection was trapped in the dark, locked in place. Then, the walls began to tremble again. The sound of something scraping, groaning, deep in the distance. Mia's heart raced. Something was coming, closer. The walls around her seemed to close in. The darkness thickened. She couldn't breathe. Her chest constricted, tightening with every breath she tried to take. The figures, her reflection, shifted, like they were alive. They surrounded her. Miya pressed her hands against the walls, trying to escape, but the walls gave way beneath her palms. The floor beneath her cracked. And then the walls fell. The blackness fell away. She was no longer in the void. She was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. Her apartment. The familiar smell of her old furniture. Her clothes scattered on the floor. But the air was thick, oppressive. The light dim, flickering. Miya stood in the doorway, staring at the broken pieces of her life scattered around her. A place she thought she had left behind. But something was wrong. The silence was deafening. Then, a sound. A whisper. It was so faint at first, Miya wasn't sure she heard it, but it repeated. Her name. Miya? It was her own voice. The voice she had used to scream. But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from behind her. She turned, and standing there in the corner of the room was the figure. Her reflection, but not like before. It was real, alive. Its eyes locked onto hers. It stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement. The floorboards creaked underfoot. Mia's pulse spiked again, terror flooding her veins. She backed away, but the figure kept coming, closer, closer, until it was right in front of her. It reached out, its fingers brushing her cheek. Cold, sharp. Her skin prickled, her vision blurring. The reflection whispered in her ear, "You can never leave." And then, just like that, the world went dark once again. No sound, no light, just nothing. And Miya felt herself falling endlessly. Into the void, the darkness swallowed her once again. But this time it felt different. This time Miya wasn't weightless. Her limbs were heavy, like they were trapped under a layer of thick, suffocating fog. Her chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on her from all sides. But there was no air, no escape. She struggled to breathe, but the darkness pressed against her lungs, squeezing the air out of her chest. Her heart raced, her skin crawled, and then a flicker, just a brief flash of light. It was enough to make her eyes snap open. She wasn't falling anymore. The ground was solid beneath her feet, but the darkness still clung to the edges of her vision. Miya stood in a vast, empty room. The walls were so high, she couldn't see the ceiling. The floor beneath her feet felt cold and rough, like stone. The silence was deafening, but in it, she could feel something else. A presence, a weight. It was pressing in from all sides. She turned, but the room was empty. No doors. No windows, just infinite space. Her heart thudded in her chest. Hello. Mia's voice echoed in the vast emptiness. But there was no answer, just the haunting silence. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, but the darkness around her seemed to pull her in, like it was alive. She stumbled back. Something was wrong. She could feel it now. The floor beneath her feet began to shake. The sound started as a low rumble, deep within the ground. It grew louder, closer. Her pulse quickened. The shaking intensified, as if the very foundation of the room was about to crumble beneath her. Mia's breath hitched. A figure appeared in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, but it grew. It grew larger. It moved toward her, slowly, purposefully. Her eyes widened. It was her reflection again. But it wasn't just a reflection this time. This was her, the real her. The same face, the same eyes, but everything was wrong. The eyes were empty, hollow. The smile stretched unnaturally wide, twisting like a grotesque mockery of her own. Miya took a step back. The figure stepped forward. Miya tried to turn and run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. Her feet wouldn't move. It was like she was rooted to the spot, trapped in place. The figure drew closer. With each step, the air around her grew colder, heavier. Her breath came out in short, shallow gasps. The figure stopped just in front of her. It reached out, slowly, deliberately. Its fingers, long and twisted, grazed her skin. Cold, icy. Miya gasped, her body trembling. The reflection's grin widened. "You can't escape," it whispered. The words felt like they were scraping against her insides, digging into her very soul. The world around her began to shift, twisting, bending. The walls were no longer walls. They were moving, breathing, as if the room itself was alive. The figure didn't stop. It reached for her again, and this time, it touched her arm. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, stretching out from the walls, wrapping around her body. It was suffocating. The reflection's eyes, empty and dark, stared into hers. The air thickened with an oppressive weight. Miya tried to pull away, but the shadows held her fast. She was trapped. No way out.
The figure leaned in closer. Its breath was cold against her skin. "You were always meant to stay here," it whispered. Mia's chest tightened. The shadows pulled tighter, suffocating her, closing in from all sides. And then, the world shattered. Everything splintered into pieces. Light, sound, reality itself. It was as if the very fabric of the universe was being torn apart. The room, the figure, the darkness, all of it dissolved. And Miya fell deeper, fell into the nothingness. Her screams echoed, but they were swallowed by the void. She was lost. Forever. The darkness stretched out before her like an endless abyss. Mia's body was weightless, suspended in the void. Her mind was a blur of panic and confusion, but something else, something worse, began to creep in. A sense of familiarity. It felt like she had been here before. No, not just here. In this exact moment. This exact feeling. The overwhelming pressure. The suffocating void. Her chest tightened as though the air had been squeezed out of her lungs. The silence was deafening, and yet, beneath it, something was whispering. A low, constant hum. It wasn't a voice she could hear with her ears. It was deeper. Inside her head. "Miya." The whisper was like a breath against her skin. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was hers, but not hers. It came from everywhere. From within her. From the walls of the darkness. Her hand shot out, but there was nothing there to touch. Nothing solid. Nothing tangible. "Stop," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "Let me go." The whispering didn't stop. It only grew louder, sharper. "Miya, come closer." Something stirred beneath her, and the ground, or what she assumed was the ground, began to shift. The sensation was wrong. The floor, no, the space beneath her feet, wasn't solid. It felt like it was made of liquid, stretching, pulling, like a gelatinous surface. Her body lurched downward, and she felt herself being sucked into it deeper. "No!" she gasped, but the words were swallowed by the darkness. Her heart raced. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to shift again, contorting around her. The air thickened, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The shadows moved. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were shapes, figures, rising out of the liquid void beneath her. She couldn't make out their forms, but she could feel them. Cold. Unforgiving. Her limbs felt numb. Trapped. The figures grew larger. Closer. They were moving toward her, and though they didn't touch her, she could feel them pulling at her very essence. You can't escape. The voice, her voice, whispered again, but this time, it was everywhere. Inside her mind. In her soul. It was her. Mia's pulse quickened. Her breath hitched. Was this her punishment? Her punishment for what? For trying to escape? For fighting? Her eyes darted around, but she couldn't see where the figures were coming from. They were everywhere. Their presence was suffocating. And then, without warning, the liquid beneath her feet solidified. A sharp, sudden jolt. Miya gasped, the sudden shift causing her stomach to churn. The darkness began to break apart around her, not in a way that made her feel free, but as though the room was being split in two, growing larger. Expanding. More figures. More whispers. She couldn't look away. Couldn't blink. Her body was stuck. Trapped. The figures gathered. They were watching. And then, a face. A face she knew. Her own face. But it wasn't her. It was different. Twisted. A grotesque version of her reflection, its smile wide and wrong. Its eyes dark voids that pulled her in. This is where you belong, it said. Her voice, but distorted, garbled. The figure reached out. Miya wanted to scream. But nothing came. The air was too thick. Too heavy. The figure grabbed her arm. The grip was unrelenting. Cold. Its fingers dug into her skin. She gasped. But her body wouldn't move. Her mind raced, trying to push through the fog, trying to fight, to understand what was happening. You're mine now, the figure hissed. And in that moment, Miya felt something. A shift. Not in the room. Not in the air. But inside her. Inside her soul. The figure's grip tightened. She could feel herself being pulled into it. Into its cold, empty void. Miya struggled, but it was futile. Her mind screamed to fight, to break free. But the walls were closing in. Her body betrayed her. Her thoughts became a blur. Her vision spun. Everything twisted and bent around her. Her arms were trapped. Her chest compressed. And then, the world shattered again. A blinding light pierced the darkness. Mia's vision was flooded with white. Her mind screamed. She couldn't stop it. Her body jerked, as if it was being torn from the darkness. The light was too much. Too bright. She tried to shield her eyes, but it was impossible. It consumed everything. And then, she was falling. Falling faster. Faster. The pressure was unbearable. And just before she felt she would be torn apart, the light vanished. The void was back. But now, there was something else. Something watching her. Something waiting. The void stretched out before her once again, but this time, it felt different. Lighter, almost. Her body was still numb, but she could feel the air around her, thin and cold. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the sound breaking the silence like a crack in the darkness. The pressure that had weighed on her chest was gone, replaced with a strange emptiness. A vast, hollow space. She couldn't tell if she was moving or not. It felt like the very concept of motion had become irrelevant here. But then, a sound. A soft, distant noise. Barely audible. A whisper? No. It was more like a murmur, a faint hum that vibrated against her bones. It came from everywhere. Mia's head snapped toward the source. But there was nothing. No shape. No figure. Just the endless black. The feeling that something was waiting. The whisper grew louder. It wasn't words at first, just a low, guttural murmur, but then it shifted. The syllables took form. Miya! Her name. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the vast silence. The whisper continued, like a siren call pulling her deeper. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything to cling to, anything to ground her. But the darkness was endless. The sound was growing louder, more insistent. Miya, come closer. It echoed, rattling inside her skull. Her feet began to move of their own accord. Slow, reluctant steps. Each one heavier than the last. She tried to fight it. But her legs wouldn't stop. Her body was pulling her forward, as if she had no choice but to follow. Closer. The whisper. The call. It was all-consuming. And then, a shape. Far in the distance, it appeared. Not a person. Not a figure. But a door. A small, dark shape against the infinite blackness. The faint outline of something solid, something real. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but she had to reach it. She had to find out what was on the other side. Miya took another step. The whisper grew louder. Closer. It was almost deafening now, the voice wrapping around her, filling her mind with 1,000 different voices. But they all spoke her name. Miya. 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 It was like a chant. A ritual. The door grew larger, closer. Her hands were trembling. Her breath quickened. The air was so cold. So thin. And then, a flash of light. Not bright. No. But the edges of the door shimmered, like a mirage, fading in and out of focus. Her feet carried her forward, faster now, desperate. She reached for the handle, her fingers grasping at it, but it didn't feel like a door anymore. It felt alive. The handle twisted, almost as if it were pulling her hand in. A sharp shock ran up her arm, freezing her bones. Her heart raced. She yanked her hand back, but the door swung open. A flood of darkness poured out, cascading over her like a tidal wave, suffocating everything in its path. Miya stumbled back, but she couldn't escape it. The blackness was like liquid, flowing over her skin, crawling beneath her flesh. Her body went rigid. Her breath caught. Inside the door, there was nothing. An endless, yawning void. And then, a voice. Her voice. But it wasn't her own. It was deep. Hollow. Chilled. It reverberated through her skull, through her bones. You're mine now. The words cracked like thunder. A shockwave of coldness hit her. Her body went numb. She tried to scream. But her voice was swallowed by the void. The door continued to open wider, its presence overwhelming. And behind it, something moved. A shadow. Not a figure. But a shape shifting. Formless. It watched her. The blackness that poured out of the door seemed to pulse, throbbing with a life of its own. It was drawing her in. Closer. Closer. The air around her thickened. Every breath was harder to take. Her heart hammered, but her limbs felt like they were locked in place. Miya! The voice was right behind her now. She could feel it, pressing against her skin. She couldn't move. The weight of it was crushing. The shadow stretched forward, a long, tendril-like shape, its presence so cold she could feel her bones shaking. And then, a hand? It reached out. Slowly. Unfaltering. The fingers were long, thin, stretching out like vines curling toward her. It gripped her wrist, cold and unyielding. Her vision blurred. Her body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside. The door swung open wider. And Miya was pulled into the darkness. The darkness enveloped her entirely, but there was no weight, no sense of pressure this time. It was as if the shadows themselves were pulling her apart, dissolving her into their void. Her limbs felt detached, floating in nothingness. Her heart still beat, though slower now, a dull thud against the silence that surrounded her. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight, paralyzed. The air, if there even was air, was thick, heavy with the scent of decay, of something ancient. Something old. The hand that had gripped her wrist didn't release. It pulled her deeper, dragging her further into the abyss. Every inch she was pulled forward, her body resisted more. Her mind screamed. Asterisk, this is not real. This cannot be real. Asterisk. But the hand didn't let go. The blackness stretched endlessly, infinite and suffocating. There was no ground beneath her feet, no walls, no ceiling. Just the feeling of movement, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around her. And then, a light. Not bright. No, it wasn't a light. It was more like the absence of it. A flicker, a shimmer, as if the darkness itself was breathing. Waiting. Her body twitched in response. The pull on her wrist stopped, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Miya felt something. A breath. A chill. The kind that gripped your spine and sent shivers all the way down to your soul. She twisted her head. The light flickered again. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't a figure. Not really. It was her. Not her reflection. Not her twisted form. But the girl she used to be. The girl she should have been. The one she had forgotten. Mia's heart thudded violently in her chest as the girl, stepped forward, her face calm, serene. No hollow eyes, no sinister grin. Just the soft, haunting smile of someone at peace. You've been running for too long, the girl said, her voice a whisper in the air. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The darkness was gone now. All that remained was the figure standing before her. And she realized. It wasn't the shadows that had trapped her. It was herself. The girl before her was not an enemy. It was her salvation. Her heart still racing, Miya took a step forward, reaching for her. And the shadows faded completely. There was light now. A soft, peaceful glow. Mia's feet hit solid ground, firm and unyielding. And in that moment, she was free. The warmth of the light surrounded her, gentle and steady. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mia's mind felt at ease. The air was no longer thick and oppressive. It was light, breathable, as if the very weight of her fears had been lifted. She stood there, in the soft glow, facing the girl who wasn't her. It was as if time had stopped, and all that had come before was fading into the distant past. The darkness, the whispers, the endless void, gone. The girl before her smiled again. There was no malice, no twisted reflection, just a pure, quiet understanding. You've been lost for too long, the girl whispered, her voice calm, almost nostalgic. But you're not broken. Miya swallowed hard. The words cut deep, though they were gentle. She felt something in her chest, a weight lifting. A release. I didn't know how to stop running, Miya whispered back, her voice trembling. I was scared. I didn't know who I was anymore. The girl nodded, the smile never fading. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and Miya didn't flinch this time. Her heart no longer pounded with fear. It was steady now, slow and even, as if everything was falling back into place. You've always known, the girl said, her words soft but firm. The answer was never out there, Miya. It was always in here. She gently placed a hand on Mia's chest, where her heart beat. In you. Miya closed her eyes. It was true. All the darkness, the fear, it wasn't just the world around her that had trapped her. It had been the storm inside her. The unanswered questions, the guilt, the uncertainty. For the first time, she felt whole. The girl's form began to shimmer, fading slowly, like mist evaporating with the rising sun. Remember, the girl said, her voice fading with the light. You are the light. Always. Miya reached out, but the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the soft glow in its place. The light softened, but it didn't disappear. It remained, a warm, steady presence around her, like an embrace that promised she was never truly alone. Miya stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the journey finally ease. And as the last of the shadows faded, Miya realized. She had found herself. And for the first time, she was no longer running. She was home.